All right, let's take the time now to speak about T1 versus DRX. You know, I think it goes without saying. I think the T1 is a heavy favorite coming into this, but I want to talk about the rest of the information that we can take away from this matchup and what we can come to expect from both teams coming into Champion Select and also in terms of their playing. I think, you know, even though T1 is the clear favorite, I don't think DRX was favorite in any of the series that they played so far, and they managed to make it work. How did DRX manage to make it work? I think that they do a good job of playing patiently, meaning that if they are not in bad positions in the game, they know which timings they need to rally around, they know what they need to wait for, they know how to protect their own camps and make sure that they farm steadily, and through that they've invited a lot of mistakes. They've been very sharp on their timings around objectives, and this is not something that Genji did well. This is not something that EDG did well either. Basically, they played in a way that invited mistakes. You could see in the first game between DRX and Genji, they held on and they didn't completely throw the game, even though they were in a losing position, and they drew out the game for quite some time, even though the position in the game was very harsh. And that first game between DRX and Genji was what a lot of people expected for the rest of the series too. The Genji would just keep it one-sided because before that matchup, DRX hadn't beaten Genji all year long, and Genji just looked like the stronger team. And people were in the state of mind that Zeka would not be able to recreate the advantages that he got of course, the matchup between him and Scout. EDG, first and foremost, they were getting caught left and right. DRX were capable of accelerating game positions where they were losing in draft through catches that Zeka made. I think in the series between Genji and DRX, I think Genji had a heavy identity crisis after the Damwon series, and I think that they had no idea what they wanted to play in the jungle. I think the only person that was performing good was Ruler. He really tried hard to carry those games. But let me get back to my initial point. DRX, in terms of their macro, I think they've been relatively decent. I think they've been relatively stable. I think they've been good at choosing their fights. I think they've been good at playing connected as a unit. You can clearly see in DRX's approach to the game that they are united, and I think this is something that Genji and EDG lacked, and I think this was the biggest reason why DRX came out ahead of that series. Coming into the finals, T1 is the clear favorite. I think that goes without saying. I think anyone who votes for DRX is smoking on the hopium pipe, but that hopium pipe has paid off big time. That is the unique thing. In the series that DRX has played so far, they were never the favorite to win it. They beat Genji on the way, they beat EDG on the way, and everyone had higher expectations of these teams, but DRX found a way to make it happen. We can talk forever about their plot armor and so forth, but we're just going to look at the fine details of how DRX actually won games and have a discussion about, not discussion, I'm just going to share what I think, and we're going to move in some kind of direction. So DRX in the series against Genji, I think there was a circumstance for them where, Genji was struggling super hard after potentially the Damwon series to find some kind of identity. If you think about the champions that have done, the best so far at the World Championship, you think, I will just show you guys some stats around this. When it comes to the World Championship, which is going to switch to 12.18. This is the Games of Legends, if you guys are curious about it. If you look at the champions that are doing the best so far, you have the Sejuani. Let's make sure that we change this to the World Championship, because this is play-ins, right? Play-ins makes Maokai look very strong. Obviously, this is a very small sample size, so it doesn't matter just as much. But the main thing I wanted to highlight here is just the Viego. The Viego is a champion that surged in, in priority due to the junglers that were playing. Very strong Viego players. You had Canyon on Viego, you had Honor on Viego, you had, of course, Kanavi on Viego, and Pioshik is not a known Viego player, but he busted it out because it looks like it's performing super, super well. Gen.G went in the direction of going so far to pick it themselves first pick, which was very surprising. It seemed, if you look at the series, that Gen.G... Let me show you guys. Gen.G, they started off in this draft. The key thing here, DRX, which will be very relevant if we look at this draft coming into the match against T1, is the fact that they are on red side banning Yuumi, Lucian, Caitlyn. Right? And if you are playing with locked bans, and if the enemy team for some reason doesn't decide to ban Aatrox, you can be in a position to just first pick Aatrox, right? Aatrox is still doing super, super well. And if you think of Zeus having his hands on Aatrox, I think I would be very, very happy, right? I wouldn't mind, even in the case where the enemy first picks Kate, you get Caitlyn and you get to counter the Aatrox. This is also a situation where Zeus is very, very fine. I wonder if Gen.G's fear here is that they don't want to be in a position where they have to choose between Aatrox and Caitlyn, and they don't have an answer into Aatrox, and in the worst case where the enemy bans Caitlyn, they can first pick the Sylas. With their Kali out, they wanted to deny the melee champions, of course, of Zeka, and they went in a specific direction. This was a situation where things played out quite well for them. There was the Sylas, and then they had the Viego, and then the Varus. So here on red side, if you don't ban Sejuani 1, 2, 3, then you are giving up Sejuani 1, 2. This is something that we saw throughout the tournament. If you don't ban Sejuani on blue side, then the enemy is going to 1, 2 it, because in most cases there's better things to first pick. And here in the case where you first pick Sylas, you're still giving Sejuani, Sejuani is giving Sylas a strong ult. But nevertheless, here Yuumi, Lucian, Caitlyn was out, Misfortune Soraka was picked into the Tahm Kench and Varus. And this particular game played out in a way that people kind of expected things to go. Gen.G playing a very stable game, and them just having good CS numbers, making sure that they clear their camps, they farm on side lane, they group on good timers, and they play the game in a very straightforward manner. As the series continued, DRX went over to blue side. Naturally, they banned Lucian on blue. This was the draft where Gen.G tried to just give up Caitlyn and to play into it. Sometimes when you are playing a tournament, you want to be in a position where you show off something that you aren't completely sure of, with the intention of cementing an idea in the opposition for the future. Sometimes, you have many scrims on Karma Varus, but it's not something that you ever played on stage. You're 1-0 up, you're going to try Karma Varus Graves, just to make sure you have that notch, like notch in the cap for the enemies of the future to consider. Because if you win this game, all of a sudden you have an answer in the first pick Caitlyn, and you've shown that you can play Graves, right? In theory, right? So theoretically here, if they can get a win here, it's going to matter so much, because no one considers the Peanut as a Graves player, and also people were always permabanning Kate. But with the way this game played out, Graves, the Peanut, he was one of the worst Graves players ever to play in this tournament. Kindred, Pioshik had a timing gank on bottom side. This is something that Pioshik does very well. He finds like these crazy ganks and crazy invade timers. Kindred is of course a pocket pick of his that he played historically, but his coaches have not allowed him to completely unleash it. Back in the World Championship, when of course Canyon won with his Graves play, Kindred was the #1 answer into Graves that people played, and Kindred walked away from that championship with even a positive win ratio against Graves. But all in all, I think that this counter, I think, is more of just an answer, and you are the one to have Kindred in your team. Nevertheless, this game, DRX definitely showed that they can play a slower game. They could wait for the Caitlyn timers. Gen.G gave up a lot of dragons, and DRX had good dragon setup, and they punished Gen.G whenever they weren't on time. So they leveraged the information very well. Gen.G was playing very disconnected. They were not playing for each other, they were playing for farm, and in that they forgot to connect, and they didn't find any timers to be around mid-wave, which is something that DRX did super, super good. So what do we learn from this series? DRX, very confident in their Varus, very confident in their Viego. Kindred is their pocket pick into a lot of the meta junglers when you think of the Graves and the Viego. An issue for them will be the Lucian and the Caitlyn Yuumi. If they ban all three, you have to consider it. Another thing that we learn about Zeka is that he has been performing really good on many different champions. It isn't just Akali, even though Akali is something that should be target banned in my opinion, because the answers aren't super clear. I think some players have been playing like LeBlanc into Akali, but before I see, you know, some insane answer into Akali, I'm not so sold on leaving it open. DRX in terms of their play, I repeat, good around Drake timers. They have good creativity in draft in order to, you know, have flexibility and adaptability. They have champion pool in their top lane. They have champion pool. Top lane is arguable. I don't think they have that big of a champion pool in their top lane, but at least in this series, their top lane had a bigger champion pool than the opposing top laner. Because in this matchup, DRX versus T1, I doubt that you know, King's champion pool can't hold a candle to what T1 is going to be able to do. But the key champions to pay attention to, and something that T1 does super well, I will show you guys here on the draft as we begin to discuss T1. What T1 does super well is that they recognize, you know, even though, you know, T1's biggest weakness probably, I think in situations where they have stronger drafts than the enemy, meaning that they're in a situation where they have strong lane matchups and their comp can, you know, contest in fights. I think T1 is clearly the best team in the world right now. I think in terms of laning, in terms of teamfight play, in terms of understanding macro concepts and punishing anyone that slips for a second, T1 has been super sharp. Like I've been going through T1's games, and it's very hard, close to impossible, to spot a mistake that Korea has done. Very difficult. This guy is completely putting everyone on farm. But let's focus first on T1 and what we learned about them in their drafts. So the first initial game, right, we have now risen in the idea of the prio of Viego. They banned Aatrox on blue side themselves this time around, showing that they just want to prioritize the first pick bot laner. In this situation, right, we saw that Viego prio has gone up through the roof. Vi is not something that was playable into Viego, and this was a game where they tried this all-in composition against Jax and Taliyah, and they played exactly to JDG's strengths. This was a very competitive game because FAKER on his Galio managed to find some very nice engages, and Lucian and Nami managed to find some picks on the Lulu and the Felios, and this is something that T1 does super good. And even though this game was very competitive, T1 had a draft disadvantage. This game could have been in T1's hands because they found such a good catch on Aphelios with the flash W of Galio. And this is something that T1 does so well. They recognize the conditions of the games, and they are mechanically good enough to really press those conditions. They know that Elder Dragon is spawning, they need to find an engage on Aphelios. Whenever those opportunities show, T1 is very quick to pounce and very quick to punish. But nevertheless, this game went in JDG's favor. We continue. This one, now they changed things up. They recognize that Viego 1-2 is going to be the biggest prio. They have the answer ready for Sylas. They picked the Rise, and Jungle was dropped. Here with Sejuani and Viego and Graves also banned, it changes kind of the structure of everything, right? JDG showed here that they don't have big interest to play Lucian Nami themselves because they banned the Graves. I think T1 have enough information to know that they can play Graves, pick Graves, and then go Lula Aphelios themselves in the Lucian Nami, or just Lucian Nami on 2-3. So they are switching up the bans. With Sejuani, Viego, Graves out, these are the three biggest prio junglers. It's very open to drop jungle and just try to find a pick that makes sense. Because these are the three biggest high prio junglers, Graves, Viego and Seju. When these are out, the jungle pool kind of gets thrown up in the air, and it is what it is. Here they showed the rise into the Sylas, something that Chovy also played earlier in the tournament, but the Rise did super good in this game, was first to roam, was first to situations. Even in this matchup, right, in terms of how things played out, JDG had some opportunities in the early game, but later as things went on and on, you could see a circumstance where T1 eventually started to choke JDG out. This was the game where they found that really clever ult onto the Nash. But in my mind here, they had once again a very hard time, finding the correct fights because their composition is very short range. Lucian, Nami, Ryze, Yone, and Poppy, they struggle in 5v5s against Sylas, Aphelios, Lulu, Bel'Veth, and Malphite. And with the conditions that JDG had, if they toned it down a little bit, they didn't get caught around mid lane as much as they did, and they didn't do that bot lane dive, and they set up their situations with a little bit more precision and didn't give T1 so much breathing room, then T1 wouldn't be able to enact their composition. Their composition being, of course, this composition that's very strong on the 3v3s on mid, very strong on the 2v2s on side, 1v1s on side, but in 5v5s, they should have a harder time against JDG's composition. Another thing here, right, which I think shows what T1 like to do, here Sylas doesn't have that many great ultimates. Often when the enemy team shows a specific champion, they like to follow a theme where they make sure that that specific champion becomes very weak in the context of the game. I think this is most obviously shown in game number 3. But nevertheless, JDG had opportunities to win this game, but T1 found that beautiful Nash, and in my honest opinion, I thought that T1's draft here is very dangerous to play. There's a reason we don't see as much split push play as before, because you need to face the music and face the fact there's a lot of fights that happen around objectives, and also, of course, you have situations where you can just play on 2 lanes and you can secure your side and give up one side, meaning that you play on 2 lanes, enemy plays on 1. You should be able to gain more in such a circumstance as long as you play macro efficiently and correctly. But in this game, JDG, they got caught plenty of times, and also T1 did a very beautiful Nash that was enabled by the fact that they're playing Yone and Ryze. But in a case where Yone maybe doesn't get that double kill on the bottom dive that JDG botched, then this game would be more difficult for T1 to play. Now we go, as we went deeper and deeper into the series, I think that T1's drafts kept on improving. The unique thing is, in my mind, what we've seen in this tournament so far, when series kind of calm down a little bit and the teams both show with which bands they need to keep within the game, I feel like a red side becomes a little bit stronger. Nevertheless, JDG went for first pick Viego. They're very happy to play Aphelios, Lulu, and Lucian, Nami. And I think the Nocturne pick was very clever. And the GP pick was also quite nice. So if you look at this situation, if I'm Aphelios Lulu and I'm playing this game, I'm very uncomfortable. There's a Nocturne ult, Lucian, Nami. Just keep in mind, you get Nocturne ulted. Everything is dark around you, and the circumstance will be that you get Lucian, Nami ulted out of Fog of War, you get GP ulted. This is very uncomfortable for Aphelios Lulu to play. They made the composition to target the Aphelios Lulu. But here, this was a very different composition for T1, because with time, I feel like their composition should be stronger in the 5v5s. It should be very hard for JDG's composition to cross certain choke points. Renekton should fall off in time, but JDG should have the priority early game. They have the way stronger early game jungle. Aphelios Lulu can contest Lucian, Nami in the lane. Renekton should have full control over the lane against GP. This is not the old GP that was so strong with the corrupting potion and so forth, where he could hard contest the early levels. This is very different. And then of course Azir into Ryze. Azir should be able to contest that and get prio as well. So JDG, they created conditions in this game where they were very strong and very far ahead. But then the moment T1 saw a couple of the mistakes, Kanavi dove top, there was the 369 not basing and then staying on the lane with a lot of gold and then all-inning with his level 6, Nocturne getting ahead and so forth. When this happened in the game, there was also of course the Ryze getting the double kill on the bottom side after the roam. This really blew up the game and the game was just completely finished. As this series progressed, Lucian Nami looked more and more broken in the hands of T1. And this is not a champion combination that T1 is going to be allowed to play again. Nocturne was a clever pickup, you know. Always you're going to be nervous as a jungler if you have to pick into Viego and Graves and Sejuani is out and you're dropping. They banned Lee Sin. Nocturne is something that is very hard to target ban here, but Nocturne is something that worked out. He fought well in the fights on top side, and then when his ultimate was available, this is a champion that can hurt a lot. But this is scary, right, for T1. If they can fall too far behind in the early game, it will be dangerous. But this is a different view of T1. I think they have so strong laners that it's rare that they're going to be falling apart in the early game, and they can find ways to claw themselves way back into the game through fighting. But this is also JDG's strength. But JDG threw away this game after the dive on top and put GP in a position where he was very strong, and T1 had a very easy game to finish and to win after their composition was ahead, because there's very little counterplay against Lucian Nami, Culling combo, and Ryze and Nocturne GP just pressing their ults whenever big fights break out. You know, the tricky thing is that if a composition like Ryze, Nocturne, GP gets ahead, they are ready to fight anywhere on the map. Nocturne can just stay in fog, GP ult is ready, and then of course Ryze hovering with his ultimate is also a thing. All in all, if we look at some of the things that we can take away from both of these drafts, right, from both sides, both DRX and T1, you know, the main question will be, how will Aatrox be treated? Right? Are they working with some information that we don't know, that they are so scared of some certain counterpick or something that we don't know so far? I am very surprised by how it's been treated. You know, there's a big advantage here for T1 is the fact that they play Lucian Nami and the enemy team doesn't. DRX has the Heimerdinger pocket pick, and the question will be, who will Korea just counter it? Will they find a way to counter it? Will they find a way to just pick something into it with Korea's vast champion pool? Something that maybe we haven't thought of, like a Misfortune support, Zyra support, something like this. I think these champions are not that great. I'm just spitballing here. I think removing Heimerdinger makes sense. They have the room to do so. You know, the main thing for me where DRX have an opportunity is that FAKER played a very good series against JDG, I feel. But he got caught on side on occasion, and Zeka has been completely smurfing out of his mind this tournament so far. I think Zeka looks like the stronger player coming into this series, but it's of course, you know, you can't deny the pedigree of FAKER and him being used to playing World Finals. That's something that is, you know, important to highlight. But that could be an entry point for DRX where Zeka finds advantages and they can snowball that. I think if T1 put themselves in drafts that are very weak and hard to play, DRX have shown that they have the patience to let their composition play the game for them. And this is where things might get dangerous for T1. If T1 put themselves in scenarios where they are very far behind, or they have drafts that are very hard to fight with, and DRX is not going to give up, you know, and make a lot of those mistakes that JDG did, like walking up on mid waves that they shouldn't, or diving when they shouldn't, and generally speaking being sometimes late for objectives and making those mistakes around mid wave. If T1 don't get those opportunities, how are things going to look, right? How are things going to look if T1 don't have those mistakes that they can just grab? Now the tricky thing though is that T1 are really fucking sharp at doing it. Really sharp. It's not like, you know, I feel like T1's players, they're very aware of any information that the enemy team gives. When the enemy is spotted on a ward, everyone knows exactly how to react. And they know exactly where to enter, they know exactly which steps to skip, and where they need to proceed in order to pressure the game. And I think this is what T1 does so well. But in a situation where T1 don't find themselves in a good draft state, what is going to happen when DRX don't offer the same mistakes?